I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Welcome everyone to VLGA Connect, and I'm delighted to bring you another episode of our Local Leaders series, where we talk to select mayors, CEOs, many of them new to the sector in Victoria, at least, to find out a little bit about them and their priorities on this program. And today, I'm very pleased to have Brent McAlister with us, who was appointed as the CEO of Northern Grampians Shire Council back in February of this year. Brent, welcome.
Yeah, morning, or kia ora, as the Kiwi cousins would say.
Indeed. So let's get that one straight off the bat. You are originally from New Zealand?
Yeah, I'm originally born and bred Kiwi in a place called Invercargill, which if anyone's been there, they would have been frozen. They have horizontal rain in Invercargill. It's right at the end of New Zealand. So I was about 15 years in local government in New Zealand, town planner originally, and mostly around Hamilton and the Waikato area.
Right. Did you work at Invercargill Council?
I did. My first job was at Invercargill Council. I won't say when, but only lasted a year, and then I was back up into the North Island. So, right. Yeah.
I only ask because they're in the news a bit of late. They've got some council law issues that are making headlines, but we don't need to get into that. So what role did you start in? What's your local government background, Brent?
Look, I'm a town planner, and so qualified town planner, and then sort of worked into around the 90s, got into management, and then pretty much been a director of planning and community services for 25 years, and then just recently with Northern Grampians into CEO role. So yeah, I've had, I think I was saying to you, I've worked in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and New Zealand, and I was very lucky that I arrived 1 month before the 2-year lockdown in Victoria, right. So it wasn't that timely.
Yeah, very, very fortuitous. So even if you had any regrets, there wouldn't have been much you could do about it.
No, exactly. I was at home for 2 years, and the month before I got here. So that was a bit of a rude awakening, really.
Tell us about the Lismore experience, because I think you were there during a pretty big flood event, weren't you, back last decade?
I was there for a decade, and I managed accidentally, is probably the best way to say, the 2017 flood, which was 11 metres, if you can picture that. And the most recent one, about 12 months ago, was 14.5 metres. So yeah, just unbelievable. I mean, basically when I was there, it went to the top of the floor of the CBD. And houses, but the recent one 12 months ago went to the second story of the entire city centre and also houses. So yeah, just probably the highlight of the flood wasn't the highlight, but managing the recovery was certainly, I'd rate that as the highlight of my career, to be frank with you.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because it would be challenging, but also probably rewarding in many ways to be able to lead people through something like that. How do you prepare for that? Because it's not like everybody's got experience with it.
Well, it was accidental. I went down to actually clean a shop, and the evacuation order was still in place. So I thought, I better not be seen downtown cleaning a shop when you're not meant to be there. So I went up to the headquarters, and New South Wales at that stage had no system for recovery. And so three young teenage university students came to the door. It was on a Sunday, I remember it. And they had set up a Facebook site to manage the recovery, to try and match people who wanted to clean and recover and those that had needs. And they said, does anyone want to help manage this whole recovery thing? So I put my hand up, and sort of 1 month later, after working 7 days a week, sort of 18 hours a day, we ended up taking over the train station and helping thousands of people. So they call it spontaneous volunteering. So it's, and so because there was no system in place, and even the most recent flood, there was no real system in place for recovery, and you would have seen the Tinny Army and the whole, basically, and Lismore's a fantastic community. They helped themselves and they went and rescued people. So I ended up with PTSD out of it, which wasn't a pleasant thing. Because you wear a lot of the emotion from people. And so I ended up having to have a thing called finger therapy. It's called desensitization therapy to try and get over it. And it was quite a big part of my career, that one. Yeah.
That's something we hear about first responders a lot, don't we? That taking on the emotion, the feelings that people are bearing. Is it something you're completely dealt with, or does it linger in any way?
Look, I went on to have sort of a reoccurring and I think it's the trauma. I still had sort of basically a situation where a family were shouting and screaming at each other, and I just kept on waking up and replaying that experience. After I had this desensitization therapy, it went away. And so occasionally when I see disasters, I sort of cry and it sort of comes back, but it's thankfully not a regular monthly thing now. No.
So I'm getting slightly off the track of the interview plan that I had, but how does, I imagine that's a useful tool now in your tool belt when you're dealing with people as a leader who might be confronted by, whatever it might be that might confront them in their everyday working lives.
Yeah, look, it's funny. I've got 5 daughters, and one of my daughters said to me once, "What do you reckon the number one leadership quality was?" And I went on about drive and achieving, and she said vulnerability. And after the Lismore flood, I'm convinced that vulnerability is actually the number one leadership qualities, because you can connect with other people. And so when I came to Victoria, so I was a month out from the 2-year lockdown, I had a whole lot of tools in my toolkit around meditation and breathing and all sorts of tools to actually cope with that. I think if I hadn't had the Lismore flood, I would have found the lockdown really hard.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So you worked in Queensland, you said. Where in Queensland?
Gladstone for 5 years, which is sort of the industrial heartland of Australia, actually. Big coal place. They've got refineries, all sorts of things. So, look, Queensland local government is far more regionalised. You've got some large cities, Cairns, Townsville, Mackay, etc., and long distances from the capital. So I think out of all the states, including New Zealand, I've got to commend Queensland as being very regionally focused. By definition, I think New South Wales is probably the most centralised, followed by Victoria, but Queensland really put a lot of time and effort into the regional areas.
And you're saying that's a positive? That's
I'm saying it's a really big positive. Yeah, I mean, you get Sydney and Melbourne centric, and the regions often feel left out, whereas certainly that's not the case in Queensland.
We'll come to that in a moment in terms of your current role. You went from Lismore, I think, to Wellington, a small shire in Victoria. Would that be one of the smallest that you've worked in?
It is one of the smallest, about 45,000. It's Wellington is often say if you die and go to local government heaven, you go to Wellington. Very positive relationships between councillors, community staff. And very, very positive culture there. So I was very pleased to. Lismore was a tough place. It had lots of little factions and issues, and it was kind of nice going to the heaven of local government. So, yeah.
So that begs the question, why leave?
Oh, look, I've got five daughters. 4 of them have moved to Victoria. I wasn't overly happy when they moved here because I'm actually got a house in Byron Ballina. So I was thinking, can't you move to Brisbane? But they moved to Melbourne, as you do. Everyone in Byron Bay tends to move to Melbourne. Everyone in Melbourne moves to Byron Bay for some reason. But so I'm here because of my 4 daughters. There are 3 in Melbourne and 1 in Snake Valley, which is the reason for one of the main reasons I'm out here. Yeah. So, and I've got a granddaughter. So kids, really.
Yeah, fair enough. So Northern Grampians was it was a good timing opportunity. Was there anything particularly about Northern Grampians that appealed to you though?
Look, I had it. It's funny when you come from New South Wales and you know everyone knows Melbourne and Melbourne is everything. Melbourne's almost Victoria for New South Wales people. I didn't know much about Gippsland. The only thing I knew about Gippsland was Hazel, the power station. What's the power station that got shut down? Hazelwood.
Hazelwood, yeah.
Hazelwood. So that's the only thing I knew about Gippsland. And then over this side, the only thing I really knew was the stall gift because of the TV. So it's funny, New South Wales people really focus on Melbourne and then everything else is a bit of a blank. So in terms of coming over here, I've got a daughter over at Snake Valley, so it's an hour and a quarter away. And driving through Melbourne from Gippsland was just not a good thing. And we've got a granddaughter, so that's the attraction really.
So what are your first impressions of the council and the community then in Northern Grampians?
Look, I did a thing called a listening tour. I usually do this when I come and basically just talk to everyone for the first 2 or 3 months. And I just thought, wow, this place has so much. I mean, some places have little substance or relatively little substance and big image. And then other places have massive substance and you don't know much about them. And so I think definitely Northern Grampians has an amazing, like for example, I went around 5 businesses in the first 2 weeks that have 1,000 jobs. And growing jobs. There's a big abattoir. The gold mine employs 300 people in a town of 6,500. So it's amazing in terms of jobs. And then it's got Hall's Gap and the stall gift. So I think in terms of qualities, it really is punching away above its weight in terms of the assets and the attractions they've got here, but perhaps just not well known. To be frank with you, not enough. I mean, Gippsland has a lot of publicity because there's a lot of money chucked at the fact that coal's phasing out, and whereas I think in terms of there's not as much money chucked over this side of western part of Victoria compared to the east.
People might be starting to become aware of the location because of the dark matter mine, perhaps. Have you been down there yet?
I haven't been down there, but it's quite unique. And we recently had someone come from England who written a book on these things, and he thinks it's pretty unique in the world. And I haven't been down there, but it's certainly something I want to do. Yeah.
So, what do you see as the big challenges, issues, or opportunities in the near future for you and your role at Northern Grampians?
Look, I think housing, it's funny, one of the staff said, what do you think the priorities? I said, well, number one is housing, then there's daylight, then there's everything else. So housing's big. It was big over in Sale as well and Gippsland, but I reckon it's at another level here because a lot of people, I mean, there's 1,000 jobs and there's big growth with gold and the abattoirs and that, and people say, well, why isn't housing being built? I've got a 30-year pedigree in planning. One thing I've learned over the years is there's a complete disconnect between demand and supply. So even if you have massive jobs like Northern Grampians, that doesn't translate into houses because at the end of the day, the margins in a place like Sale or Stall are so much thinner compared to, say, Ballarat, Bendigo, and Geelong, and therefore developers, it's a risky game. And if you can get a 30 or 40% return in those bigger cities and a bigger margin and sale price, why would you go to smaller areas even if there's lots of jobs? So I think it's a tough one here. It's not helped by a few things. I certainly don't think the windfall gains tax is coming in on the 1st of July. It's not affecting us here so much, but I know over in Sale, the developers were in a mad hurry to get land zoned by the 30th of June this year. Why would you put a tax on to around, and it's really affecting regional areas, that tax. I don't know if you've heard about that, but it's a big one.
Yeah. I've noticed a few statements coming out of your council recently about some pretty big issues for you. Power transmission infrastructure is one, regional
Yes,
banking services is another.
yes.
How effective do you feel you can be at the size you are in advocating for better outcomes on those big issues where you're dealing with big corporations and other
Yeah.
levels of government?
Yeah, look, we certainly, the V&I, and we were just at a meeting with EMO yesterday. One of the things I said to the CEO of EMO is that you need to tell the story of why V&I is required, and the Marinus link, which is over in Gippsland, they're connecting Tasmania and New South Wales because obviously going out of coal into wind and solar, when it's not windy and it's not sunny, they need to draw energy from the pumped hydro and the snowy, and also in the dams in Tasmania, and therefore those connections are required. Otherwise, there'll be a real issue. So I think that story hasn't been told, the bigger picture of why those connections with New South Wales and Tasmania is required. I'm not sure why. Look, to be honest with you, the big NBNs and the EMOs of the world are basically utility providers. I probably think they're not well set up for PR consultation and communication. Their NBN is the same. They're big utility. They're good at power and connectivity, but when it comes to consultation and things, and so our council has been, we've had two very large meetings, 160 and then 260 people in a town hall in St Arnaud. We very much support the farming community. The information and the consultation has been completely inadequate. One thing that I have taken from Gippsland, because we had offshore wind there, is we've set up a transmission online forum. So we get all the various players, VFF, EMO and everyone else and the council fortnightly to just talk about the issues. So I reckon communication is the way to go, but it's been rushed through, and I understand why it's been rushed through. I was over in Gippsland and all the coal-fired power stations are being shut down quicker than had been thought of, so therefore these connections need to be rushed through and put in place. We understand that, but look, the farmers are really upset about this, and quite rightly so.
Oh, well, good luck for getting some sort of acceptable outcome out of all of that. One thing I know we do well in Victoria, and I'll be interested in your view on the other states you've worked, particularly at CEO level, is work together in regional groupings particularly, and I assume you've met all your neighbouring CEOs and you share your stories and band together on broader regional issues?
Yeah, look, I've noticed that, and there's we're in two groups, the Central Highlands and then the Wimmera one, so we sort of caught between the two, which is kind of nice. So you go two groups instead of one. And there's a lot of support with CEOs. I've had a number of CEOs ring me up and say, hey, do you need to connect with things? So I think I reckon you're right. It's one step up from New South Wales and elsewhere, that sort of peer support is really good. And so I've really appreciated that since I've come here.
Given you've got a planning background, I did want to ask you, there's some are calling it a crisis in the sector at the moment. I know as recently as this week, Alpine Shire has had a review released which says its strategic planning function is in crisis. Anywhere you look, councils are struggling to get planners. How do we solve this problem? It must be particularly concerning to you as a long-term planner.
Look, I think the thing is, there's a couple of angles to this, Chris. One, I think particularly in Victoria, like Queensland, for example, they have a legislation that was put in 2009. We've got legislation in Victoria 1987, and in New South Wales it goes back to 1979. So I think the systems need reforming. There hasn't been much appetite in New South Wales or Victoria to do that. Why have we got legislation that is almost 40 years old or more, whereas Queensland have, reformed and updated? So it's not particularly attractive for planners where the system's very outdated. And so I think that's one. I think the other thing is that I think, and particularly around governance, we've got to protect our planning staff more. I can remember, many meetings in Lismore, staff being called liars and greens and all the rest of it, and staff looking on Facebook, 3 days out and can't sleep at night and all the rest of it because they're attacked. I think we've got to protect our staff more because what they do is they go into consultancy. There's more money in it and less angst. So I think the culture of councils, one thing that we had in Wellington, which was really good, is we had 100% delegations, which is unique. And so they had complete trust in planning staff. And so every decision was made by staff. And it also means that developers like that, because there's certainty. As soon as something goes to council, and no disrespect to councillors, there's uncertainty of decision making. So I think there's a few things, but it's not a profession that people are flocking to. It's a bit like health inspection. It is a real crisis. Thankfully, we've got very good staff here, which is great.
What other areas are of concern to you in terms of being able to attract good staff?
Building inspection is more dire than planning. And you can't, for example, in Wellington, we had a building inspector that was sort of in his 70s and, we were keeping him going because he actually was an MBS and they're like hen's teeth. And some councils having to have certifiers out of the Gold Coast, because they just can't get anyone in Victoria to do it. I really think private certifying everyone's gone to that, and councils aren't the attractive option. Private certifying is another story, but I think building inspection would be the hardest and the most difficult profession to recruit in local government, followed by planning, and then engineering appears to be getting better. That would be my assessment.
Perhaps one last question. You will no doubt be aware that a number of councils are now being targeted by what are being variably described as far-right extremist groups, etc. Have we seen any of that getting out into your neck of the woods yet?
Thankfully not.
Okay.
Thankfully not. I think I've heard there are people that support that approach in the Shire, but hopefully they're not listening to this broadcast.
Probably unlikely
as a trigger for it. But it's not pleasant. As I say, when I was in Lismore, we didn't have that group, but we certainly had extreme left and extreme right groups targeting council. We often would have 200 people at meetings, and we even had the old Arabic shoe throwing incident and lots of abuse. And we had security at every meeting. So I think it's not pleasant. It can age you. In fact, it can reduce your life expectancy, that sort of stuff. And so I think it's very corrosive for senior staff. And then, of course, those groups tend to get in as councillors, and then that sort of raises it to another level when you've got councillors who represent those groups. So I don't know if that's happened in Victoria where those groups have got into council. But
there are examples, yes. There are examples. All right, Brent, really interesting to get your insights on all of those issues. I want to wish you well for your term at Northern Grampians. I hope it's a long, fruitful and satisfying one. And I hope this experience today has been enjoyable for you too.
Yeah, well done. Thanks for that. No worries.
Thank you very much. That's Brent McAlister, the new CEO at Northern Grampians Shire Council, on our Local Leaders series from VLGA Connect.